The Queen and I will always keep in our hearts the inspiration of this day. And may we ever be worthy of the goodwill which I am proud to think surrounds us at the outset of my reign.
He was frequently described as excessively shy, very retiring, very nervous, resistant to appearing in public at all.
He was someone who hadn't sought kingship, he had it thrust upon him. And his whole life really was, from then on, was about coming to terms with that and trying to be the best king that he could be.
Today, we give thanks to God for a great deliverance.
George V took to the throne just before the outbreak of the First World War, and he was the king during that war. That clearly had a profound effect, obviously not only on him, but on the nation. He changed the name of the royal family. He got rid of its former European Germanic connections from the House of Saxe, Gothenburg and Gotha. In 1917, he changed the family name to the Windsors. It was he who created the House of Windsor. His children were brought up under what appears to have been a very strict disciplinarian regime, particularly the two older boys, Edward and Albert. But the king himself, King George V, although we're now told, well, he imposed corporal punishment personally on his sons, I think probably was only really acting in the standards of the day.
George VI had a very difficult childhood. It seems that he began to stammer at about the age of 8 or so. In order to explain why that happened, there are various factors which appear to have contributed to it. One of them was the fact that he was left-handed, and as was the practice of the day, he was made to write with his right hand.
He suffered from knock knees and was forced to wear what we believe were very painful splints on his legs. Again, at the time, I suspect that was quite normal practice for those families, obviously like this one, who could afford the best medical advice.
George V had a problem of actually expressing to his son his admiration for him, really what he thought of him. And that there's a sense in which, if only he could have done that, if only he could have actually said that to his son's face, it would have certainly psychologically, I think, helped George VI.
Let us go back to those early days when the second son of King George V was a bachelor, a young man called Prince Albert. For him, life was a constant round of public duties faithfully performed, with a word and a smile for everyone. As second son, Prince Albert might have passed his time pleasantly in the sports and luxuries of the well-to-do, but that was not his way. In those days, as in these, his aim was to do his duty.
The relationship between the future Edward VIII and Bertie is an interesting one. I think on one level it's a relationship, a typical relationship between two brothers who are close in age and in which the elder brother dominates the younger brother. It's a typical kind of relationship that I think anyone in that situation would have. I think what one has to add to that is the fact that Edward VIII was such a good-looking, confident, charming individual.
It's easy now to sort of look back on it and say they were always at loggerheads, they were always rivals. Bertie felt that he was always overshadowed by Edward. And I don't think in the early part of their lives that was true.
When his elder son the future Edward VIII, was embarking on a whole series of adventures with married women, his father was getting more and more exasperated with him and was becoming closer and closer to Bertie. And there is the famous line in which George V says that he expects his elder son to ruin himself within a year as king, which he actually does.
Bertie, like his father, was a pretty simple guy. He liked hunting, shooting and fishing. He liked country pursuits. But he was brought up in a family that by and large was pretty dull. And Elizabeth Bowes-Lyons, who went on to be the Queen Mother that we now all know, really represented a breath of fresh air in that. She had interesting friends, she had great parties, she was very attractive. She was a complete break from the kind of lifestyle, the rather repressed and dull lifestyle that he was used to.
His marriage to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyons, the future Queen Mother, had an extraordinary influence on his life. At first she was reluctant to marry him. He had to woo her quite hard. In the end she gave in.
From that day in April 1923, when the wedding of the Duke of York and Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was solemnized at Westminster Abbey, this royal husband and wife have typified those stable things in life which are most worth having. A daughter was born, and the Empire's rejoicing was a forecast of the affection that we now have for Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret Rose. A royal family, an ideally happy family, a high example of the unity of the home which is the foundation of national well-being.
I think that was probably the best thing that ever happened to him. He found true happiness. He had with her two children, Elizabeth and Margaret. They created the family unit that he always referred to as we four, and that was absolutely the bedrock of his life. He was a devoted and loving family man.
She was extraordinarily supportive of all his problems, particularly the stammer.
That stammer overshadowed any major public appearance that he had to make. He hated public speaking.
She was really the one that encouraged him to seek treatment because she just really wanted him to be cured.
My grandfather came to Britain in 1924 with just a few savings, unqualified clinically to treat stammering, put himself into the centre of the British medical establishment in Harley Street, took offices in Harley Street, which is a pretty bold move for a kind of a Australian sort of outsider, unqualified outsider. The Duchess and Duke went to see a play, and backstage they met a young actress called Evelyn Boo Lane, who had been seeing my grandfather for her own voice problems. And the conversation turned to the Duke of York's impending trip to Australia and how anxious he was, and she recommended Lionel to him then, or to the Duchess, and the Duchess then organised the first interview in October.
When the Duke first consulted Logue, they had an extraordinary number of meetings. It was very, very intensive indeed. It worked out in the first 14 months or so that they met 80 times, sometimes meeting as often as once a week at the very beginning, or often more frequently than that.
And whether it was the fact that Logue was Australian and the trip, his anxiety was about a trip to Australia, maybe had something to do with that.
An Empire tour. Australia fated the royal bride and bridegroom with sunshine and smiles and cheers.
The main reason why the Duke consulted Logue to start with was because he was about to embark on a tour of Australia and New Zealand. He had not performed terribly well at a speech he'd made at Wembley, which is the speech which opens the film.
Some of the entries in my grandfather's appointment card explain the nature of the King's stammer in detail, which helped Colin develop the acting stammer.
You know, there are a lot of experts who help people who do stammer, and they're supposed to help you not stammer, but there aren't any experts to help you stammer, and there aren't any books on how to stammer. So you're a bit on your own with that one, really. You know, if it hadn't been for the fact that David Seidler, our writer, had struggled with the stammer all his life. This is a man in his 70s. And so being an authority on the subject and being extremely eloquent as a writer, I needed to look no further. Really, he described it so powerfully that it was a great deal of help.
He then continued to consult Logue, not on such a frequent basis in the late 1920s and 1930s, but then after the abdication of his brother at the end of 1936, then their relationship really moved up a gear.
The king has a cold. That simple announcement was made on Friday the 17th of January. No undue alarm was felt until the following morning, when a bulletin was posted at the gates of Sandringham, stating that signs of heart weakness had appeared, which must be regarded with some disquiet. The Prince of Wales and the Duke of York were joined by the Duke and Duchess of Kent at the king's country home. On Sunday, the king had a restful day, but at 9:25 on the following day, a further bulletin was issued. The king's life was moving peacefully towards its close. Shortly after midnight, the world heard the broadcast announcement. Death has come peacefully to the king at 11:55 on Monday the 20th of January, 1936. His Majesty had passed away peacefully in the home from which, on Christmas Day, he talked to us, his people, as friend and father.
Worldwide interest centered on Broadcasting House, headquarters of the BBC, when His Majesty arrived by car to deliver his historic message. The King was met by the Chairman and the Director General, Sir John Reith. A few minutes later, for the first time in the new reign, the nation and empire's millions listened to the voice of His Majesty King Edward.
It has been an ancient tradition of the British monarchy that the new sovereign should send a written message to his peoples. Science has made it possible for me to make that written message more personal and to speak to you all over the radio.
He was incredibly personable, not only at a social level, not only as a socialite, but also on the streets, meeting the public. He had a great ease and a great charm about him, but it simply could not be allowed to go on. It wasn't acceptable in those days to get married to a twice divorced American woman if you were going to be the King of England.
I love you truly, truly, dear.
There was enormous resentment towards Wallis Simpson within the royal family, particularly by the Duchess of York, was horrified at her behaviour and took a strong and instant dislike to her and to what she was doing to the royal family. Edward was in love, persisted with the relationship. I mean, it was simply unacceptable to not only the royal family, but to the government.
December the 10th, 1936, one of the most momentous days in the history of England. On this day, the decision of King Edward VIII was awaited with anxiety throughout the empire. From number 10, Sir John Simon and Mr. Walter Monckton left after consultation with Mr. Baldwin. At Fort Belvedere, where King Edward had spent this week of destiny, dispatch riders were constantly arriving from London.
As the abdication crisis was gathering its head of steam, the public were blissfully unaware about this because the papers didn't print the story at all until the last minute.
King Edward and his brothers left Fort Belvedere to listen to the wireless announcement of the proceedings in Parliament, which were to mark the closing stages of the reign. A last dispatch from Downing Street, and the Prime Minister left while crowds grew here and at Westminster to learn what might be the news that was feared to be of abdication.
Bertie viewed what was happening with a growing sense of alarm and horror. I mean, he said subsequently, the last thing I wanted was to be king. And I suppose that almost up to the abdication, he hoped that this could be averted. He had never been trained to be king. He was a senior member of the royal family, second in line to the throne, but that's a huge difference to the role that the Prince of Wales, his brother, had.
The abdication of Edward VIII in 1936 was hugely divisive. There's no doubt that the British establishment, the church, the government, parliament and so on were against Edward VIII marrying Mrs. Simpson. I think popular opinion was quite different, and it's quite interesting if you look at accounts from the time, the popular papers in particular, the tabloids as they would have become today, were quite supportive of him, and generally speaking I think public opinion was quite in favour of the idea that he should marry Mrs. Simpson if he was in love with her. So which made it very, very difficult for his brother when he came to the throne. I mean, as he pointed out, he was the only king in British history to come to the throne with his predecessor still very much alive and there.
What are your views on this?
I think the king should marry the woman he loves. The nation is behind him, and we must not lose him.
My opinion of the king, he should marry who he loves. He's been a good chap to the working class. That's my opinion of him.
I reckon the king should please himself who he marries, because he knows he's got everybody behind him.
This is Windsor Castle. His Royal Highness Prince Edward.
A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as king and emperor. And now that I have been succeeded by my brother, the Duke of York, my first words must be to declare my allegiance to him. With his long training in the public affairs of this country, and with his fine qualities, will be able to take my place forthwith. During these hard days, I have been comforted by Her Majesty my mother and by my family. The ministers of the Crown, and in particular Mr. Baldwin, the Prime Minister, have always treated me with full consideration. And now we all have a new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king.
When the abdication finally happened, it was a real body blow to him. It wasn't something that he had been preparing himself for months and months and months. And Bertie sobbed on his mother's shoulder for an hour. He was devastated. He did not want the crown. He was the most reluctant monarch. But, of course, needs must, and as we now know, he rose to the occasion.
The Queen Mother, in her message to the nation, said, "I commend to you King George VI. I ask you to give him the same full measure of generous loyalty which you gave to my beloved husband. With him I commend my dear daughter-in-law, who will be his queen. I know that you have already taken her children to your hearts. It is my earnest prayer that the loyalty and unity of our land and empire may by God's blessing be maintained and strengthened."
Beseeching God, by whom kings and queens do reign, to bless the royal Prince George VI with long and happy years to reign over us. God save the King.
I think there was a perception abroad that when he became king, he really wasn't up to the job. He was ill-prepared, he wasn't good in public, he was diffident, he was shy. His stammer had caused him to have an explosive temper, which erupted and took some time to calm down.
One of the most extraordinary statements made in the run-up to the coronation was one by Cosmo Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, I think he thought he was trying to be helpful, but he pointed out in a speech that the king had suffered from a speech impediment, that hesitated slightly when he spoke, but that he'd made progress with it and people should bear with him, essentially.
From the king's point of view, to draw attention to his biggest problem like that must have been pretty shocking.
There's an extraordinary entry in Logue's diary when Logue commiserates with the king and says how unfortunate he thought the Archbishop's words were, and the king replies, "Are you gunning for him too? You should hear what my mother says about him." And I think that really sums up how awkward that was for the king.
I think it's significant that in the coronation of George VI, Churchill, who was in the Abbey at the time, turned to his wife and said the other one would never have done. You were right, the other one would never have done. So he had seen that although he'd been an associate and a supporter of Edward VIII, that in fact the throne would be, the crown would be in safer hands under George VI.
In 1937, on May the 12th, we saw the coronation of King George VI in Westminster Abbey. And all through this long and solemn ceremonial, the princesses watched. Princess Elizabeth, only 11 years old, was now heir to the throne. With ritual unchanged for many centuries, her father was crowned king.
After the drive back to Buckingham Palace, the royal family came out onto the balcony, acknowledging the cheers of many thousands of men, women and children gathered below. It was the beginning of a reign fraught with many dangers and trials, but George VI was to prove himself one of the greatest of our kings.
The coronation itself demonstrates quite how close Logue had become to the king. Much to his surprise and his delight, he and his wife Myrtle were given seats in the royal box, much, I think, to the horror not only of Cosmo Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, but also to a number of other people who couldn't quite understand why the king wanted to have his speech therapist sitting in pride of place. But it just underlines quite how what had begun as a professional relationship had turned into a genuine friendship between the two men, and the king really needed to have him physically close by.
After he was made king in 1937, then it stepped up a gear, and both the king and Logue, were catapulted into this new role. The king needing that kind of constant sort of attendance and also therapy to to face the microphone and to deliver the speeches that he had to do so many more of.
The Queen and I will always keep in our hearts the inspiration of this day. And may we ever be worthy of the goodwill which I am proud to think surrounds us at the outset of my reign.
George VI had the misfortune, I think, to become king at the dawn of what was essentially the radio age. Before that, all a king had to do was to stand up or not to fall off his horse, as one of the great lines in the film. That changed, of course, in the 1930s with the invention of radio, and that was the big problem for George VI, that had it been a century earlier, probably people wouldn't even have noticed that he had a stammer.
The next year brought the King and Queen's first state visit to Paris as guests of President Lebrun. Then the great tour of Canada, a tour as successful as the one undertaken by the King's elder daughter 12 years later. During the tour, America was visited, and the King and Queen met President Roosevelt in Washington.
This was the late 1930s. There was the worsening international situation. Hitler was already beginning his aggression across Europe. And so there was a sense in which there was a huge challenge that he was going to need to rise to meet.
Aus ihrer Kenntnis heraus sich die Voraussetzungen zu schaffen für die Überwindung des Folgezustandes.
George VI was very, very much in favour of appeasing Nazi Germany. He wasn't a supporter of Hitler. He was horrified by Hitler, but he very, very much did not want war, to the point that when Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich with the famous, Peace in Our Time, piece of paper, the king appeared with him on the balcony at Buckingham Palace.
For many days, the statesmen who guide the destinies of our empire have been in anxious consultation over the crisis in Czechoslovakia. War has so far been averted, but yet they have been able to bring us no nearer to a hope of permanent peace. The king has returned from Scotland in order that he may be closer to the seat of government and consult more easily with his ministers. And a crowd at Buckingham Palace welcomed him back to the capital. The hour of need has found the man, Mr. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister. Since he took office, Mr. Chamberlain has never wavered in his determination to establish peace in Europe. At the hour when the dark clouds of war hung most menacingly above the world of men, the Prime Minister took a wise and bold decision. Well may we call him Chamberlain the Peacemaker. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was at Heston to see the Premier off on this epoch-making flight to Germany, the first flight he has ever made. Flying with him as advisors were Sir Horace Wilson and Mr. William Strang. Before he left Heston, your Prime Minister spoke to you through Gaumont British News.
I'm going to meet the German Chancellor because the situation seems to me to be one in which discussions between him and me may have useful consequences. My policy has always been to try to ensure peace, and the Führer's ready acceptance of my suggestion encourages me to hope that my visit to him will not be without result.
We know that no man could do more than he. But since we also know that it lies not in the power of mortals to command success, we say with all our hearts, may God go with him. Three cheers for Chamberlain.
The king very, very much did not want this country to go to war. It is, of course, what happened in the war that now, I suppose, we most remember him for.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, had already declared war earlier that day. This was the first chance for the king, the kind of the father of the nation, to speak to his people and to speak to the empire. The speech which ends the film, the King's Speech, as it's become known now, was obviously an extraordinary, important speech.
In this grave hour, perhaps the most fateful in our history, I send to every household of my people, both at home and overseas, this message, spoken with the same depth of feeling for each one of you as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you myself. For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are at war. With God's help, we shall prevail. May He bless and keep us all.
Yes, the king had difficulty speaking. It was a radio address, it wasn't filmed. Yes, there were pauses in it. Yes, knowing what we know now, he had difficulty with some of the words. But actually, if you listen to it, it's quite moving and quite dramatic. And the pauses, I don't think really, under the circumstances, sound that terribly bad. It was a very, very moving address to the nation by a man who, in the war, became very much associated with the sufferings and the tribulations of his subjects.
In a sense, one could say that the Second World War came to his rescue, because he was there, played a very statesman-like role during the Second World War, and by the end of it, he was absolutely entrenched as a beloved king.
But whether in France with his troops or at home with his bombed people, his courage and cheerfulness were an inspiration. This was total war, and the king suffered, with so many of his subjects, the bombing of his home.
This was the effect of a time bomb that exploded in the grounds of the king's London home. It fell only a few feet from the palace building, close to the king's sitting room. The day before, the king and queen had been visiting other parts of London which had suffered from bombing. The sympathy which they extended then has come home to them. Truly, this is a war of all the people. We're all in it. A bomb, released by a Nazi bomb aimer in a plane that is being chivied all over the London sky, might fall anywhere. And so it is that their majesties are walking among the debris in the garden, just like other families in 100 homes today. But Buckingham Palace is not by any means demolished, nor for that matter is the rest of London. London is taking it on the chin.
The king was at Buckingham Palace when it was bombed by the Luftwaffe and himself narrowly avoided death. It was at that moment that Queen Elizabeth said, "Now we can look the East End in the face," famously. But he was very much associated with the suffering of the people. They would visit bombed areas in the East End of London regularly. The king underwent a regime of rationing. He personally measured the water in the baths at Buckingham Palace, because in those days you weren't supposed to fill your bath above a certain level. There was a sort of ink mark on the bath. He personally supervised that to make sure that nobody was wasting water.
I am speaking to you now from Buckingham Palace with its honourable stars. To Londoners, first of all, though of course my words apply equally to all the British cities, towns and hamlets who are enduring the same dangers. The Queen and I have seen many of the places here which have been most heavily bombed, and many of the people who have suffered and are suffering most. Our hearts are with them tonight. To the men and women who carry on the work of the ARP services, I should like to say a special word of gratitude. The devotion of these civilian workers, firemen, salvagemen, and many others, in the face of grave and constant danger, has won a new renown for the British name. These men and women are worthy partners of our armed forces. We live in grim times, and it may be that the future will be grimmer yet. The walls of London may be battered, but the spirit of the Londoner stands resolute and undismayed. As in London, so throughout Great Britain, buildings rich in beauty and historic interest may be wantonly attacked. Humbler houses, no less dear and familiar, may be destroyed. But there'll always be an England and to stand before the world as the symbol and citadel of freedom, and to be our own dear home.
During the war, the king had weekly private luncheons with Churchill. They hadn't got on particularly well to begin with, but that did change. And through those luncheons, and there was nobody else present, it was totally alone at Buckingham Palace, he was privy to all that classified information, and that weighed very heavily on him. And he knew the danger that Britain was in. He knew when Churchill talked about the darkest hour, he knew what that meant. While Churchill was the flamboyant face politically of British defiance, while he articulated all those tremendous emotions, you know, we will fight them on the beaches and all of that stuff, the king retained a calm exterior, went about his job in a very unflamboyant way, meeting members of the public, going to the scene of bombings in the East End. And I think that made a big difference to the nation. And I think George VI, during the war, was a king that people in this country could very much associate with. And that was a pretty important role.
May 8th, 1945, the day of victory in Europe and scenes of thankful rejoicing in the heart of the Empire's capital, which have been echoed throughout the world. Trafalgar Square is a rallying point for many of the happy thousands who come to welcome peace. All over London, the fortress of freedom in the dark days, millions rejoice in final and complete victory after a war lasting nearly 6 years. From early morning until late at night, tremendous crowds make their pilgrimage to Buckingham Palace to pay tribute to our King and Queen, who have shared with their people the dangers and bereavements of total war. They stand on the bomb-scarred balcony of their home, which has suffered like so many thousands of others in this our land. At this moment of thanksgiving, His Majesty the King speaks to his peoples and his fighting forces throughout the world.
Today, we give thanks to God for a great deliverance. Speaking from our empire's oldest capital city, war battered, but never for one moment daunted or dismayed, speaking from London, I ask you to join with me in that act of thanksgiving. Germany, the enemy who drove all Europe into war, has been finally overcome.
If you look at him at the end of the war, when his address to the nation was on film, the price that he paid is very visible. I mean, he had aged enormously. He was a man under great strain. After the war, he was horrified when Churchill was kicked out in the first general election, but very quickly adapted to life with a left-wing socialist Labour government. And Aneurin Bevan, who was the health minister in those days, the father of the NHS, struck up a particularly strong relationship with the king, oddly, because Bevan was the son of a Welsh miner, the last person that you would have thought would have any kind of interaction with a monarch. Both of them had a stammer. There was an immediate reaction there. So the king adapted to the changing times and could see the way that society was changing in Britain.
True to its function of expressing the will and spirit of my people, the House of Commons continued to fulfill its duties despite the bombing of its home. The new chamber has been built as near as possible in the form of the old.
It suggests an almost homely place of discussion and taking counsel, as if it derived some of its virtue from the family circle. But this chamber, in a sense, belongs to our great family, for it is adorned and enriched by generous gifts from all over the Commonwealth. This new chamber will stand as a sign to the world of our faith in freedom, where free men and women can speak in accordance with the dictates of their consciences, yet with that saving grace of humor and readiness to understand the point of view of others, which has ever been typical of our race. Not for us the silence of suppression. In other places, liberty has perished. But the voice of true democracy is still heard among all our peoples and is a comfort to all those who love and believe in the unfettered expression of honest opinion, a noble aspiration, and sincere of human feeling.
There's no doubt that the war took a very heavy toll on the king and on his health. He'd always been, his whole life he'd been in poor health, poor physical health. The strain of the war certainly didn't make things any better.
The whole British Commonwealth is with His Majesty the King, following the statement by his medical advisors. His Majesty's most recent public appearances are recalled by these pictures. Remembrance Day saw the King at his customary post, though already feeling the effects of his complaint. At the Territorial Review in Hyde Park, His Majesty personally inspected every unit. From the beginning of his reign, our much-loved King has never spared himself in the cause of his people, who wish him from their hearts a speedy and complete recovery.
It's quite interesting that one of the last speeches that he makes, last Christmas speeches that he makes, he insists on making, but they have to cut it together out of tiny fragments of lots of different takes, just because he wasn't well enough by then to speak for 2 or 3 minutes uninterrupted.
The King, who is returning in a Viking of his special flight, arrives at London Airport after breaking his holiday at Balmoral for further treatment. The nation's concern at His Majesty's illness is reflected in the crowd of loyal sympathisers gathered in the rain outside the palace to offer their own personal tributes. And as the King returns to his capital, the fervent prayer of all Britain's peoples is, "Here's a health unto His Majesty."
As we celebrate the 15th anniversary of his accession to the throne, we recall the first great occasion in a life of wise and kindly kingship, his coronation. The next year brought the King and Queen's first state visit to Paris as guests of President Lebrun. Then the great tour of Canada, a tour as successful as the one undertaken by the King's elder daughter 12 years later. During the tour, America was visited, and the King and Queen met President Roosevelt in Washington. Then came the war. a severe ordeal for a young monarch. But whether in France with his troops or at home with his bombed people, his courage and cheerfulness were an inspiration. This was total war, and the king suffered, with so many of his subjects, the bombing of his home. But the tide of war was turning when the king visited his victorious armies in North Africa. Later, following the Allied invasion of Europe, the king met Field Marshal Montgomery in Normandy. The long years of war ended, and who in these islands will ever forget Victory Day? So, with Britain at peace, the king and queen with their daughters traveled to South Africa in HMS Vanguard. And with the marriage of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip, a time of great joy for the royal parents. 1951, and Britain proclaimed her achievements at the South Bank Festival. But 15 years of kingship had taken their toll, and His Majesty underwent a major operation. Anxious days, but as we now learn with happiness, the king has taken over his many duties once more. So, let us offer humble thanks to the heads of our great family of nations for 15 years of unfailing and devoted service.
On the 31st of January, King George VI came to see his daughter off from London Airport. She and Prince Philip were off to tour the Commonwealth, taking the King's place while he continued to recover from a serious illness. Their first stop was at the Treetops Hotel in Kenya.
This is London. It is with the greatest sorrow that we make the following announcement. It was announced from Sandringham at 10:45 today, February the 6th, 1952, that the King, who retired to rest last night in his usual health, passed peacefully away in his sleep earlier this morning. Now he has laid the burden down. Even a king at last may rest. Now he puts off the unwelcomed crown that heavy on his temples pressed. The frets of state, the bitter wars, the cares that filled that anxious breast, these marked him like a soldier's scars. But even a king at last may rest. Grant him thy peace, O Lord, we pray. Who of us all has earned it best? Who wore for us his life away? Give thou this king a warrior's rest.
The Queen, the King's widow, better known as the Queen Mother, the way we know her, found the whole process very painful and continued feeling this well after the King's death. In fact, David Seidler, who wrote the screenplay for the book, approached the Queen Mother for permission to access all of this. Queen Mother flatly refused, saying that she found the memories too painful, even then in 1981, and that please do not make the film in my lifetime. Out of respect to her, David Seidler didn't resume any development on the film.
Very distressing for the Queen Mother. She had never wanted Bertie to be king, and she could see better than anybody else the strain that George VI was under, physically, emotionally, the stammer, all of the sort of health problems that he had, and she cared for him and the family very, very deeply, and was an extremely protective wife and mother of that little family unit. Having stood by him through all those really difficult years, the war years, of course, tragically, he died at the age of 56, and she went on, well, to almost double that age as a widow.
The death of King George VI in 1952 was obviously a huge event for the country, a very tragic, sad event for the country, because he was still only in his 50s, And I think it's difficult for those of us today, the majority of those of us today who haven't lived through that, to quite understand what an extraordinary outpouring of grief and mourning there was. And also the, I suppose, concerns about whether his daughter, who was still then very, very young indeed, the extent to which she would be up to the job, she'd be able to take over as monarch. She wasn't even in the country at the time when her father died.
The new Queen's ministers, led by the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, with Attlee, leader of the opposition, assembled to greet her as she flew back into London. The British people had to bury a king, and the Queen her father.
For 15 years, King George VI was king. Never at any moment, in all the perplexities at home and abroad, in public or in private, did he fail in his duty. Well does he deserve the farewell salute of all his governments and people.
When the king died, Churchill had written on the wreath that he laid on his coffin, "For valour," which of course are the words that appear on the Victoria Cross. He proved himself to be a monarch of his time. He wasn't flamboyant, he wasn't extravagant, he was a devoted and loyal family man. He was the epitome of the values of the day.
The king's body was taken for burial to Windsor. As he was buried at Windsor, London came to a halt in silence. Most men were wearing black ties, most women some mark of mourning. With all their impulse to examine old values, wrote the Times, people do still respect them. Even the normally bouncy tones of the newsreel commentators were appropriately subdued.
The king is laid to rest, and the majesty of death ends with a family beginning its life anew. A young queen takes over the burden of monarchy.
A burden perhaps made no easier by the high hopes with which her people, now slightly self-consciously, entered a new Elizabethan age.